in the morning will be served, in the breakfast room, but you're welcome to come down here, bring your breakfast down here to eat. And we'll also have, some items here for breakfast in this room alone as well.
I think he's fast.
Hey, Dr. Tony Headley, I've known him for quite a few years. I've heard him numerous times. We had him
Chris.
years ago with that
Chris, can
in Albany.
can you
Okay.
speak over here?
Here we have Dr. Headley, a few years ago, with us in Albany, he's talked about trauma-informed care, if you recall that. And it's kind of backed by popular demand. He's very, very gifted. He's a licensed psychologist and a service provider in the state of Kentucky. Been a professor at Asbury for quite a few years, since 1990.
1990, retired in 2021.
Sort of.
Kind of, sort of, yeah.
Taught many courses. I've been to a couple other conferences where he was a keynote speaker, several of them. Besides teaching responsibilities, been coaching other doctor of ministry students and conducts many, many seminars all over the country, for church-related organizations and chaplaincy groups. And taught a course called Flourishing in Ministry at Asbury. A PhD in counseling, dissertation personality characteristics of the Minnesota multiphasic personality inventory. People are probably familiar with that one, actually. A lot of us are. MS in family studies, master's in ed in counseling, psychology, and an MDiv. So he's a psychologist and a clergy. So we've got someone who's very well rounded, and we're talking about moral injury. Folks, we are sort of subject to moral injury ourselves. There's times that we make decisions and we wonder, wait a minute, what did I do? And we wonder, do no harm, right? We should be living by that, but sometimes we walk away from it and say, wait a minute. I did EMS for a number of years professionally, and there's some stuff that I dealt with decisions I made or choices and treatments and even driving that I went back and the tapes go in my mind. And we carry these wounds. And the military, for doing that, I know a particular drone pilot with faulty intelligence took out a family of 8. And he goes home and has dinner with his family. What do you do with that? So moral injury is both for the people that we're working with, they're dealing with it. The officers were dealing with it. I can tell you firsthand, a number of officers have come to me and said, hey, what do I do? I'm asked to do stuff that goes against what I believe. So this is a very, very pertinent topic for both service providers and the people we're working with and the staff we're working with. Dr. Headley, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
The microphone, I don't know if that's on.
Oh, it's not very loud, is it?
It's up, but you need to point it at your mouth.
Okay.
Well, let's see if I can get my stuff working here. Need to point the mic at your mouth, please. This one? That's not the mic, that's the light. Okay. My stuff doesn't seem to be coming up.
Oh, no, Karen. Once again.
At any rate, while I'm waiting for that to come up, I really appreciate the opportunity. So thank you, Dr. Chris, for inviting me to be with you. I will tell you this, that I've had the opportunity to be in a number of different environments. This mic is not working.
I don't really.
I think it's not plugged in.
Oh, give it 1 minute. Oh,
Oh, there
yeah, they need to come this way a little more.
Move it over a little more. That's probably why it's not working, because it's not.
Okay.
How's that?
Yeah, I hope it's working. Yes, it sounds like it's working now, and I'm also plugged in. We've had to do a little bit of makeshift to get these monitors to work. I want to say to you that are over here, if you want to move your chairs to the other side so you don't have to strain your neck, that would be okay with me. It's a little bit of a different kind of setup. I'll tell you this, I've had the opportunity of working with people in different settings that I think moral injury, which is a relatively new concept, was present. 2 years ago, three of us from Asbury Seminary and including myself, so there were four of us, and three of us were psychologists. We actually were in Ukraine. We went to a city in Western Ukraine near the border of Poland. We had to drive from Krakow, Poland, some 200 miles into Lviv. And every night when we were in that city, we were subject to drone attacks and bomb attacks. Fortunately, the hotel had a bomb shelter. And every now and then you would hear a voice come on in your room in the evening saying, "We are under attack, please go down to the bomb shelter." And we had the opportunity there to minister to some 46 persons, leaders, Christian leaders, who were traumatized by the war. And no doubt they had made decisions that impacted their own sense of moral defilement. A couple of years ago, several of us went to, first, one year we were in Burundi. Next year we were in Rwanda, and we'll be actually going back to Rwanda in January of next year. And as we were driving through the country, you could see all of these memorials to the genocide that had happened across Rwanda. I remember talking to one pastor who happened to have been a Tutsi, and they were under attack. And he said that he walked through the jungle all the way to Burundi to escape. No doubt, people in those circumstances have experienced some trauma and have also had to make decisions that have defiled them morally. So I want to talk today about understanding, today and Thursday, understanding and treating moral injury. One of the first things that we learn about moral injury, which is a relatively new concept in terms of research, but it is not a new concept in terms of history. In fact, one can trace the roots to ancient Greece. One of the Greek playwrights, Euripides, described it as miasma, which was the Greek concept of moral defilement or pollution. Jonathan Sher, in his book, talks about combat trauma and the trials of homecoming, uses this Greek term that had reference to Trojan warriors and their combat trauma, although the focus shifts to that of the returning warrior. So in ancient Greek tragedies, often written and performed by combat veterans, spoke of miasma, a moral pollution or defilement arising from participation in war, and whose cure was believed to be catharsis. Those of you that are familiar with Freudian approaches to psychology know that word catharsis, which was a ritual social cleansing. So, in moral injury, unjust killing, or any transgression of moral values could cause defilement to the perpetrator, to the victim, and even the observer. Actually, when I saw that term, the observer, it reminded me of one of the criteria for PTSD, which talks about people who witness these kinds of events. And moral injury has been studied across various disciplines, ranging from psychology to philosophy. Actually, I've encountered studies which talks about investigators of child exploitation and how encountering these child exploitation situations has left them morally defiled. Incidentally, since pretty much all of us, or maybe all of us are here, are clergy, this term has also been investigated in relation to clergy sexual misconduct. So they talk about the clergy who has become a perpetrator and how that morally defiles them. I don't remember the name of the large church pastor out of Texas, but I just read a report that he has been given 6 months in jail for exploiting a young girl over a number of years. And think about his act and how perpetrating that act contributes to his own moral defilement. And then think about the sense of betrayal that that young girl and perhaps her parents and other members of his congregation had experienced because of his behavior. This term, actually, moral injury, was coined by a fellow called Jonathan Shea, who was a psychiatrist working in Veterans Administration Hospital in 1994. And it was initially introduced to account for symptoms that were not covered in PTSD. Later on, you will discover that there is some degree of overlap between PTSD and moral injury. They all begin with some event that one has to respond to. And so initially, people thought, okay, maybe this is just another instance of PTSD. But in reality, PTSD does not account for all of the symptoms that you experience in moral injury. And so PTSD diagnosis was insufficient to account for what happens in moral injury. And also some of the treatments suggested by PTSD approaches were not adequate. And so Shea began to come up with another way of thinking about what is happening to these people who have experienced these events. And what do we need to do differently that addresses the moral injury that probably lies, most instances, lies side by side with a diagnosis of PTSD. Shea proposed a model that talked about betrayal. In fact, one of the things that you will realize shortly is that there is no real clear definition of moral injury. In fact, what you encounter in the literature, as I will show shortly, is two models. One that emphasizes betrayal, and the other that emphasizes perpetration of a particular act. And actually, this idea of perpetration came 10 years later in the work of Brett Litz and his colleagues. And they talked about and articulated the deleterious moral impact of violence and killing in war on the post-war lives of veterans. Also, it's not just veterans. Research on moral injury has also been experienced quite a bit by medical professionals. And this research on medical professionals now represents the largest body of research outside of the work that is done with veterans. I said early at the outset that this idea of moral injury is a relatively new term. Goes back to 1994, but in 2009, there is a much more robust attention to moral injury. And you find this in psychological studies as well as military studies. Don't know what happened there.
Oh.
They unplug.
Got 1 minute.
Okay.
I swear. Okay, I'm slack here. Pulling pretty tight here.
Okay. Especially you see this in some work with veterans of the US military's wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And now, even though initially it was seen as somewhat synonymous with PTSD, moral injury is now recognized as a syndrome in its own right. And it has its own characteristic etiology, that is the way it develops, and its own presentation. So what is the focus of moral injury? It seeks to identify what are some of the means of healing, recovery, and repair for those morally injured by the experiences in combat or similar kinds of situations. So let me now talk a little bit about who are the persons that typically experience moral injury. Although much of the research is done with veterans and service members, moral injury is not simply restricted just to veterans and service members. Prime candidates for moral injury is anyone who has failed to act or not lived up to their own standards and ideals, or participated in an act that they never thought they would. It really involves a kind of a betrayal of their own moral code. Those who experience moral injury are much more likely to have strong values and hold to deeply held beliefs that are challenged in different kinds of situations. So anytime you encounter a situation where your deeply held moral beliefs are challenged, the potential for moral injury is there. It also says that individuals who are strongly attached to their values may carry the burden of this wound. When I saw that, I thought about burnout. Because you see, there's a certain kind of person who burn out. And those who burn out are the ones who are most empathic, who care more deeply, and who are much more dedicated to their clients. If you don't have those characteristics, you don't burn out very well, very easily. Similarly, those who are much more likely to experience moral injury are the persons who come with deeply held moral beliefs and who find themselves in many moral situations where they have to make decisions that clashes with their deeply held moral values. I encountered a number of terms. Lost it again. Oh, okay. I encountered a number of terms that not synonymous with, but are related to moral injury. One of those terms was moral fracturing. It is the shattering of one's whole moral base and moral understanding. Cher actually used a term called moral dislocation. And he defined moral dislocation as a circumstances where an event creates such a cognitive shock to the individual that the images, the songs, the emotions, and the effects of the event are overwhelming, and they are left in a state of hyperarousal that is very debilitating. This particular author describes moral fracturing as resulting from a choice that contradicts what the individual believed to be good in a high stakes situation. Actually, that kind of definition very much fits with the work of Jonathan Shea, who emphasizes this sense of betrayal. And when that happens, it is accompanied by guilt, demoralization, and isolation. In my research, it also seems that moral injury lies on a continuum, with the lower end being moral frustration, where we experience various kinds of challenges to our morals. When Dr. Chris was introducing me, he mentioned some of those own situations in his own life and in the life of chaplains, where sometimes you have to make decisions that are not fully in line with your own moral values. Many of those situations probably lead to this idea of moral frustration. And the research suggests that moral frustration is relatively common when we experience things that challenge our moral beliefs. A little further down the line is what they talk about as moral distress. This is a little bit more challenging. It is a response to various kinds of moral stressors. And then at the ultimate end is moral injury, where there's a response to potentially morally injurious events. So you move from moral frustration, relatively common, moral distress where we are challenged or morals are challenged, and then moral injury where we actually experience some injury from having been involved in that situation. So moral challenges lead to moral frustration. Have any of you been challenged in your work in the various settings where you work?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's inevitable. So moral challenges are fairly common. Moral stressors then lead to moral distress. This particular definition I'm talking about here, this continuum, actually fits well with Brett Litz's discussion, where he talks not so much about betrayal as an emphasis, but he talks about perpetration. He shows how moral frustrations and distress may have become moral injury. For instance, he suggests that the pandemic was a trigger, and that this affirms the proposal of a continuum of morally relevant life experiences and corresponding responses. So moral frustration, moral distress, but at the extreme, morally injurious events can lead to moral injury. One of the things that we could say, not sure what's happening.
I'm not sure. No input.
Anyway, I'll go ahead and maybe I'll come back up.
Is it plugged in fully to your computer?
Yes, it is. And I'll put it forward just
Weird. Is this loose? Looking for signal.
Not getting a signal at all now.
Oh, I'm sorry. Seven is right now, that's weird.
I'll go ahead nonetheless.
We're gonna try to put it on my computer,
Huh?
put it on my computer if you want. You have it on a thumb drive, I can put it on my computer,
Well,
I can try.
what? It'll be a little bit difficult to do that now. Let me just talk and then, you'll hear what I have to say. Maybe it'll come back up. Not sure what the problem is.
The old fashioned way.
Yeah. So moral distress is often, even though it is not the same, it's a precursor to moral injury. And moral injury can have long-lasting negative impact. Try it. Whereas moral injury is the immediate emotional response to a difficult situation, moral injury is a deeper and a more enduring psychological, spiritual, or social harm resulting from actions or witnessing actions that violates one's moral beliefs. Now, three things are mentioned here: psychological, spiritual, and social harm. I think part of the reason why Jonathan Shea developed this idea of moral injury is because originally people were thinking only in terms of the psychological impact of morally injurious events. And they were largely ignoring the spiritual or the social harm that ensues from moral injury. I think this is part of the reason why, I think it was back in 1981. I think it's 1981. Peter Marin wrote an article called Living in Moral Pain. And I'll talk about that a little bit later in my presentations. What Peter Marin discovered as he was working with veterans, that oftentimes, and he was working with veterans with PTSD. But what he discovered is that in their work with counselors, in their narratives, there was often a lot of spiritual dynamics that were at play. But the counselors didn't know what to do with it, and they largely ignored it and only dealt with the psychological features. And they left unattended the spiritual ramifications. And actually, in terms of moral injury, the main focus is the spiritual injury that happens within the lives of these individuals, which is why if you're working with people who are experiencing moral injury, it is not sufficient to only deal with the psychological ramifications of that problem. You also have to deal with the spiritual. You also have to deal with the social harm that is a result of that experience. Both moral injury and moral distress involve an ethical conflict, but moral injury is much more profound. So I'm going to talk now a little bit about the criteria for moral injury from the perspective of two definitions. One of them is the betrayal emphasis that we find in the work of Jonathan Shea, and the other is the perpetration emphasis that we find in the work of Brett Litz and his colleagues. Jonathan Shea, and this is the guy that I said was a psychiatrist working in VA hospitals, working with veterans, he said it's a betrayal of what's right in the soldier's eye. They're called to do things. In fact, what Shea suggested is that they were given orders by their superior officers to engage in acts that violated their moral conscience. So a betrayal of what is like, that's why he emphasized betrayal. The betrayal comes from the supervising leader who gives these commands that conflicts with the soldier's morals. And it involves someone who holds legitimate authority, that is the superior officer. And it is done in what he calls a high-stakes situation where you have to, it involves life and death, and you have to make quick decisions. And that is Jonathan Shea's emphasis. That moral injury largely involves a sense of betrayal by a supervising officer who has power to command in a very difficult kind of situation. But let's not only apply that to soldiers at war. What about, for instance, maybe a supervising chaplain gives an order to a lesser person, a person under their care, chaplain under their care, to engage in something that violates that chaplain's morals. You're dealing with a very similar situation. Notice too that it can occur in response to acting or witnessing behaviors that goes against an individual values and moral beliefs. Incidentally, one of the things that I mentioned earlier, but I will reiterate here, is that the idea of moral injury is a concept that is in development. It lacks a standard definition and universal consensus. That is why there are two definitions of moral injury currently, and other persons suggest other things that might almost suggest something a little bit different. What is true is that the moral dimension of this term suggests that not only a transgression against human dignity and rights, but also the deepest sense of what it means to be an individual who has an immortal soul and who was created to flourish. Some suggest that moral injury is a tentative, an evolving category of harm that spans the psychological, the emotional, the moral, the spiritual, the behavioral, and relational dimensions of human personhood. In other words, moral injury is not restricted to any one dimension of our own human nature. It is actually pervasive in that it impacts a number of different areas of human life. So it is, looking at it at one stance, it is the distressing psychological, behavioral, social, and this particular author said sometimes spiritual aftermath of exposure to such events. It is something that I would probably differ with, because I think it is not sometimes, it is always a spirit, there always is a spiritual aftermath. There's a spiritual consequences. Generally, moral injury is conceptualized as a long-term emotional, psychological, behavioral, spiritual, and social distress, which is accompanied by a decrease in functionality when an individual is exposed to, witnesses, or is unable to prevent traumatic events that violate their moral values and beliefs, or when they are betrayed by someone that they trust. In this particular slide, I want to emphasize a transgression. The individual, and I don't know that I like that word, feel like. I have to sometimes, used to sometimes tell my students in counseling, the counseling class, because they like to use that word feel, when in reality they mean they think that something problematic has occurred. So the individual thinks a transgression. It is that idea of a transgression that places it in the moral realm. A transgression occurred, and that they or someone else crossed a line with respect to their moral beliefs, generally accompanied by guilt, shame, disgust, and anger. I'll say a little bit more, I think, in the next session about guilt, shame, and disgust, particularly guilt and shame. I have a particular view on those problems. So what are some of the situations? Combat situations where a soldier must kill. Healthcare workers facing difficult choices about who receives limited resources. I suspect that we could put chaplains here. So who do we have time to attend to? There are many people that are in need, but you have limited resources, not only within your setting, but you have limited resources within your own self. So who do you attend to? In fact, it suggests that individuals in any profession who have to make decisions that conflict with their personal ethics can experience moral injury. Medical personnel, for instance, may feel guilty about life and death decisions that they have had to make. And survivor's guilt is fairly common. What do I mean by survivor's guilt? That's a kind of the term that is used when, for instance, maybe two people are at war and one dies and the other survives. It involves wondering why we have blessings and privilege that are not afforded to those we work with, or why we have survived a tragedy when another person did not. Here's a situation that I think applies in hospital environments, prison environments. Guilt may be experienced when forced to tell someone you cannot meet their need due to insufficient funding, narrow scope of a project, or other reasons beyond your control. I wonder if any of you have ever had to make those kinds of decisions because you work in an environment where there are limited resources that doesn't meet all of the needs that are around you. And so personnel may feel guilt and shame when catastrophic events take place at home while they're abroad. So they're kind of, I wasn't at my post. I should have been there. And workers may be left confused and frustrated at having to leave behind friends in the event of an evacuation. I thought about, at least what comes to mind now is the evacuation from, I'm blocking the name, that country, where there was Bagram Air Force Base.
Afghanistan.
Oh, you're right.
And think about those who got out and those who didn't. And think about the survivor guilt that must have swept over those who had escaped when others did not. And some personnel may feel betrayed by decisions that are made by leadership that limit the ability to meet the needs of some other persons. Again, you can hear in that Shay's definition of moral injury as a betrayal by superior officers in a high stakes situation. Moving into medical settings, doctors and nurses may feel burdened to work with very little rest. Think about the pandemic. That was a major problem. Very little rest because they see themselves as the only source of help for people. If I take a break, people die. And so maybe some of us push ourselves beyond our limited resources. And I hope you realize this today, that as a human caregiver, our resources are always limited. Always limited. And yet we work in environments where the demands are limitless. It's a bad equation. How do you meet limitless demands with limited resources, including your own? You really don't. And personnel may have witnessed acts of oppression or violence and wish they had done something to stop it. I want to share this chart with you that I ran across. I thought it was very, very informative. It was actually in an article dealing with the development of moral injury in law enforcement officers who were investigating child exploitation. And I thought it provided a great example of how moral injury develops. So first of all, we could go to, and I don't know if it bumps off the screen. Perhaps. Yeah, start there with the event. There's a potentially morally damaging event. And then we go to that inner circle, their experience as assault on the mind and the body. So an event happens. This is partly why there was some kind of confusion with PTSD, because each of them begins with an event that is experienced as an assault on the mind and body. And then the person makes what I could call a primary appraisal. Does the event fit with my moral framework, my worldviews, and my actions? So there's a kind of a moral assessment. In studies on stress, we call that primary appraisal. Does this mean threat, harm, or loss to my moral values? And if no, it's not a big problem. But if I say yes, then it has the potential to lead to a morally injurious event. And then there's a step called dissonance between the appraisal of the event, belief system, and worldview. So the two of them conflict. My appraisal and my values and belief system. And then when that comes, it's another assault on the mind, leading to a variety of possible feelings, including shame, guilt, powerlessness, frustration, depression, self-harm, a sense of rejection, and a loss of spirituality. So there are many different ramifications. And then in order to cope with all of that, the individual may engage in some problematic behaviors, like drinking alcohol, maybe too much exercise, avoidance, keeping busy, self-harm, and burnout. So there are a number of negative ramifications. If you go over to the section called narrative, you can see the kind of self-talk that one might engage in as they experience these different stages. I'm watching media footage of abused children as part of my job. This is the person who's investigating these child exploitations. It hurts me because I can't protect these children. I'm a police officer. It is my role to be able to protect these children. I want to protect them. I should be protecting them, and yet I am unable to do so. I know what is right, but I cannot do it. I feel some or all of these things, and I may behave in some of these ways myself. I think Chris talked about some police officers that he's talked to that share some of these things. I had one psychologist friend who used to do a lot of work with police officers. Actually, it was a very strange way of doing therapy because he often met with these police officers in cornfields. Way in the middle of a cornfield for anonymity, because these guys don't want to be known that they're getting this kind of help. So he said he conducted therapy sessions in the middle of a cornfield with police officers who experienced many of these kinds of problems. Two perspectives. Does a moral injury impact others, or does it affect the individual? So some of the literature talks about moral injury other. Another person's actions or requirements, this is the betrayal model, results in military personnel perpetrating or witnessing actions that deeply conflict with their internalized moral framework. And then moral injury self, which actually has to do much more with perpetration. One's own actions that I perpetrated or inaction. So one of the things you see here is that moral injury doesn't simply relate to acts of commission. It also relates to acts of omission. One's own actions or inactions generated a potentially morally injurious experience. And then there is a resultant dysfunction which disrupts the sufferer's ability to function in relationships, in the world, and in their own sense of self. Let me briefly describe these two models, and I think I'm probably getting a little bit close to the end of this first session. I'm not sure about time, but so two models, two definitions, which is part of the reason why they say that there isn't any one definitive definition of moral injury. Currently, there are these two prevailing models or descriptions of moral injury. One of them is the one from Jonathan Shea, which we can describe as a betrayal model. Someone in high command gives an order to someone under their command, an order that violates that person's moral values. The result of the betrayal of what's right in a high-stakes situation by someone who holds power. I thought about that, and I wondered if David's sin with Bathsheba can be considered both an act of perpetration as well as a betrayal by someone who holds power. And actually, this is where I believe that clergy sexual misconduct comes into play. Because if you were to read some of the work of Marie Fortune, who talks about these kinds of situations, the clergy person is always the person with the power who betrays someone under their care or someone over whom they hold power. And so this is often true in our own circles involving sexual misconduct. Actually, some people suggested that since the work that was done in 1994 by Jonathan Shea there has yet to be an international standard definition of what constitutes moral injury. In fact, this author suggested that there are multiple descriptions of what is and is not within the scope of moral injury. And there also remains considerable disagreement and a need for greater consensus in the field. One of these focus is betrayal. The other one is the perpetration model. The lasting psychological, biological, spiritual, behavioral, and social impact of perpetrating, failing to prevent, or bearing witness to acts that transgress deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. So those two models, betrayal, perpetration. Again, as I thought about perpetration model, I also thought about David's sin. And in Psalm 32 and Psalm 51, you see some of the sense of moral defilement that David experienced, having perpetrated an act of rape on Bathsheba. Now, you don't often hear many people say that what David did was rape. It was. It's a person with power who exerts that power over a vulnerable person. Oh, the grace of God, to think that David was a man after God's own heart. You know, as I think about things like that, and I try to explain those kind of situations, it's difficult to come up with an answer. The only thing that came to mind is the heart is deceitful and desperately wicked. How else do you describe things like that? So the perpetration model refers to the damage done to one's conscience or moral compass when that person perpetrates, witnesses, or fails to prevent acts that transgress their own moral beliefs, their values, or their ethical codes of conduct. Unaddressed, those kinds of acts can lead to feelings of being unworthy of forgiveness. And it can lead individuals to contribute to a withdrawing from loving relationships and other kinds of problems, including self-harming behaviors, poor self-care, alcohol and drug abuse, severe recklessness, and parasuicidal behavior. But it can also contribute to self-handicapping behaviors, including retreating in the face of success or good feelings. And it can also lead to demoralization, confusion, bewilderment, futility, hopelessness, and self-loathing. But the most damaging part of having perpetrated various actions or witnessed is the possibility of enduring changes in self and other beliefs that reflects regressive over accommodation of moral violation, culpability, or expectations of injustice. So that's what I have for you in this first session, to think about what does it mean? What does moral injury mean? And even though there is not a large consensus on definitions, there are two that stand out: betrayal, perpetration. And there are a number of deleterious consequences that the person who engaged in or who experiences moral injury events, it can have some deep ramifications in their lives. In my next session, I'm going to talk about problems of moral pain, processes, and consequences. And there I'll try to lay out some of the ramifications, particularly with an emphasis on the problems of shame and guilt. I have a particular way of thinking about those that I think they're not the same, they're not going in the same direction, but I'll make that clear in the next session a little bit later. I'll stop here and see if you have any questions or comments, questions that I can actually answer. Yes,
It's interesting that you, by the way, very good presentation.
thank you, sir. I'll come a little closer so I can hear you.
Yeah.
My ears are challenged by my age. Yes,
Yes, it's interesting that you cover these areas because one of my backgrounds is social work.
Mhm.
I've worked in this field for a long time. And I have dealt with a number of persons who had suicidal ideations and some who have actually attempted
Mhm.
and were unsuccessful.
Mhm.
And had to deal with them, and the whole question of moral injury would come up. And well, what I want to see right now, a number of veterans who had marital problems
Mhm.
because they're dealing with issues they have done, and feel that it's not possible for them to be forgiven.
Mhm. Mhm.
And the issues that they would love to talk through with their partners. And they believe that they cannot because they will never be forgiven.
Mhm. Mhm.
And they talk about the guilt and shame that they endured daily, and they become miserable.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree with everything you said, and in fact, this afternoon, I'll be talking a little bit about some of those things, particularly, this sense of guilt and shame. My own belief about guilt and shame, and this is just kind of a preview of where I'll go. I recall reading a book several years ago, and I talked about it in one of my books called Created for Responsibility. A book by Michael Lewis called Shame, the Exposed Self. Okay? And it's interesting that Michael Lewis, as far as I know, is not a Christian, but the cover of his book has a picture of the expulsion from Eden.
Wow.
It's amazing. And so he differentiates between shame and guilt. And I actually think that in order to help people with moral injury, you have to be able to differentiate between shame and guilt. Because I think about shame as hiding, okay? You cover up, okay? Anytime you see cover up, whether it's Watergate or what have you, you're dealing with shame, it's cover up. And stuff that is covered up cannot be forgiven. It has to be uncovered. And so this idea of being able to share, even if you can't share with your spouse, difficult, has to be shared somewhere, has to be uncovered in order for there to be any kind of healing. Yeah. So I'll talk about that
That's
later.
where I came in.
Huh?
That's where I came in the picture.
Yeah,
To listen.
yes. You are the recipient, in a sense, as a minister, you are there to hear the story and offer absolution. Really what it amounts to. Yes.
Okay, on that note, though, I think like chaplains and pastors quite often get put in sort of a silo, where they don't have space to talk about the things that they're humans, right? They're still humans too. Like I heard you talk about power, and there for sure is power in that space, but when you put someone in power, there has to be space for them to be able to also talk, like, which is why I think a gathering like this is good, because folks are in similar positions, right? But quite often you don't have those folks, or people don't find those folks, and then so I wonder, how do you move past the shame stage if you are putting yourself in a situation where you are a leader and you expect a lot of yourself, and the people around you expect a lot of yourself, but then you don't have space, or you don't make space for,
Your own outlet? Is that
yeah,
what
like
you-
an outlet, like, yeah, I mean, I think in chaplaincy, we talked about that being very important, right, that we need outlets, but I quite often, I see that in ministry and in folks who are caring for others, that we forget to do the very thing that we tell other people.
Yeah, that's true, that's true. You have to find your own outlet. I don't know what that means. Maybe it means sit it down on a kind of a monthly kind of talk with a therapist or a counselor or something, but somewhere you can unburden yourself, because as we engage morally injurious events and persons who are suffering from moral injury, we ourselves are injured in some way. Actually, that led me to think about some of the work of Charles Figley, who talks about compassion fatigue, and he talks about secondary traumatization. So when we engage the trauma material, the morally injurious events of the people that we're working with, we ourselves are experiencing some of that. And he suggests that, I think that it becomes necessary then to find an outlet to talk about those things ourselves. And I'll mention one other thing that comes out of the research of Charles Figley. Because a lot of people who go into chaplaincy and other caregiving situations, we are highly compassionate people. In my latest book, came out last year, it's an update of a 2007 book. But I updated it last year, updated every chapter, and I added 2 new chapters. Has to do with compassion. We're very compassionate people. But some of the research that I encountered suggests that a difference between self-compassion and other compassion.
Yeah.
And that as other compassion goes up, self-compassion goes down. So we are so intent on being compassionate with others that we sometimes are not aware of our own vulnerabilities and our own need for healing. I think it has to be more like this, rather than this. And many of us work in situations where there's a high compassion for others and very little compassion for ourselves. Yes, sir.
Two things. So first, I try to take as much notes as I could, okay? So is it possible to get a copy of that presentation or not?
Afterwards, I'll send
Okay.
a handout copy to Dr. Chris.
We'll put it through the council site.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that it seems to me that we can extrapolate this model into all kinds of nuanced situations.
Okay.
So if what I wrote here is that the moral that results from events that transgress deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. And it happens when a person acts. So if I, as a chaplain, or anything, if I could help someone and I fail to help that person that is in need of shelter, of food, of justice, whatever, you see what I'm going with this?
Yes.
Then it is a person that especially has the authority to actually help.
Okay.
I've got money in the bank, why know who I can influence to get money out of the bank so we could help this person?
Yeah.
Authority. So would that consider part of that?
Well,
Because
I'm glad you raised the idea of that you have the ability to help. Because I think if you have the ability to help and you don't, that's something different. But if you don't have that ability to help, I don't think I would even think about moral injury.
Right, no, but it's precisely, that's why I say you have the authority and you are in the position to help. You have the authority, you are in the position and have the authority,
Okay.
but you don't do it.
I probably would come under the idea of, acts of omission.
Within the same model.
Yeah,
Right.
within the perpetration models.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay,
Okay. Did I see another hand? Yes, sir.
It's probably piggyback off of what he just said earlier in answer to her question. The main term thing she's looking for is accountability partner.
Yes,
You're a
yes,
Therapist. okay?
yeah,
You're a pastor.
yeah,
I have deacon, board of deacons, board of elders at your church.
yeah.
Where I was going to chaplain, for men, they're not comfortable dealing with certain men issues that, they're really not comfortable with sharing with their spouse. There's another man who's a trusted best friend to go as the accountability partner.
Yeah,
Sorry.
well, I agree with that. I hope I didn't convey a bias towards therapists, being a therapist myself. But I think any kind of accountability, mentoring kind of relationship would be very useful. I actually think it's very useful for people in ministry to have some kind of a mentoring relationship where they can unburden themselves. Actually, we often think about that as social support, okay? Where you have someone with whom you can share some of your challenges, your accomplishments, those kind of stuff. And it has to be someone else in the field who has some expertise on the subject, so they know what they're talking about. So maybe you meet with another chaplain on a monthly basis just to unburden some of those kind of issues and share your successes and your failures. One of the major benefits of social support, it's a significant buffer against stress and burnout and the like, is to have someone else with whom you are in relationship where you can share successes and failures.
Problem. And Broome County's hit the news. You've probably heard about Broome County, some of the stuff that's going on. And my chaplaincy staff, the discussion was, are we being a part of the injustice? And my conclusion, which I share with them, no, we are here to be a light for and a help for those that are dealing with this stuff. An ethics professor, probably knew Dr. Truesdale, I don't remember him, Al Truesdale, Nazareth Seminary, one thing, the ethics class, one thing I came back, out of all this ethics stuff, the one thing I remember from the class, he said, bloom where you're planted. So if we could be a source of inspiration and help and compassion for people where they are, because the other stuff I can't control. But if I could be a light and a listening ear, I'm not part of the system anymore. I'm helping them cope with the system.
Thank you.
We are scheduled for a half-hour break or so right now. Feel free to check in if you haven't had a chance to do that to get your room. There are refreshments here which are about to be refreshed. See you in half an hour or so.
I'll put my collar on. You're a packer. It's pretty little.
Yes.
You must have somebody
No, it's fine. Good. No, you've done all the. Yeah, I saw that. I got scheduled.
I could thought about coming here and talk about it with Fred. I mean, it could be a little bit.
Yes, I. Right, yeah. Yeah. Time out, yeah, I'm out. I can't.
Yeah, okay. We won't be looking at each other anymore.
Really.
I wanna be